Hello everyone, welcome back to another Woodworking Wisdom. You've got a new host today, me, Sean Evelegh, and in today's episode we're going to be cutting dovetails by hand. Now if you've never cut a dovetail before, or you've cut dovetails before, this video should still be helpful because I'm going to give you tons of tips, beginner tips and advanced tips. So hopefully you get something out of this video. So if you want to follow along at home, the size of the stock I've got a piece of ash and walnut here. They're both 10 centimeters long. The ash is 16 millimeters thick and the walnut is 15 millimeters thick. It really doesn't matter about the size. That's the size I've got. They can be the same thickness, but this is the material I have, so we'll go with this. Okay, so a lot of people use jigs. I'm going to show you today how to do it without jigs, okay? And it takes a bit of practice. If you've never cut a dovetail before, if you dedicate a weekend or a day to practicing dovetails, and let's say you cut 10 in a day, you'll definitely notice the difference between the first one and the last one. So I've got a bit of a different way of cutting dovetails. Some people go straight to marking out with a marking gauge, but I'm going to show you, in my opinion, a better way. We're going to mark with a pencil first and then go to the marking gauge. It's going to make cleaning up later a lot quicker. So I'm going to make the ash the tailboard. So once you've been cutting dovetails for a long time, depending on the width of your board, you'll be able to tell how many tails looks good. With a board this thickness, I think 3 tails looks good. And here's a tip, you want the ends of the boards to finish on pins. I don't think it looks good when you've got a half tail on the end. Traditional dovetails end with a half pin. You can see this is a normal pin, it's angled on both sides, but the end is flat on the ends. Now, as you can see, because there's no supporting material on the outside, this pin is a lot weaker than this pin that is sandwiched in between the tails. So you want that end pin to be thicker than the ones in the middle. So I always start off 5 millimeters into the board. I'm going to mark a line there. I'm going to use a square to mark that. Now, there is a caliper trick that a lot of people use, which is great, and it helps you equally divide the space up for the amount of tails you want. I've just got so used to using a ruler, I don't use a caliper trick, but I know I want 3 tails, so I'm just going to divide it by 3. The distance between these two marks is 9 centimeters, so I'm just going to mark every 3 centimeters. Okay. So that's roughly like that, and the top of my pins is always 3 millimeters. Now, I think this is very important because you're spending a lot of effort hand cutting dovetails. Now, you don't want the dovetails to look like they've been cut by a router or a machine. So I always make my pins small enough that there's no way a router bit could have cut that. You can see the top of the pin is 3 millimeters, which is far too small for a shank of a router bit to fit in. But it is big enough for your marking gauge to fit in to mark those lines. So if you follow those measurements, I guarantee you'll have dovetails that look hand cut. So with these 2 marks I just made, I'm going to mark 1.5 millimeters from each point. So I'll end up with a 3 millimeter gap. And then I'm going to mark that with a square. Now, you always want to do these measurements with a pencil. You do not want to mark out the tails with a knife. I see some beginners doing this. Remember, we haven't cut the pins yet, so your tails can be pretty inaccurate, and it still doesn't matter because you're going to make the pins fit the tails. And drawing a knife line is very difficult to follow and it's just unnecessary. So you want to use a pencil, and now it's time to mark the angle. And again, this is personal opinion. I always go for a 1:8 ratio. Most fine woodworking cabinets and drawers use 1:8. I think is the most traditional. I really like the look. You can go for a 1 in 6. Most people say 1 in 6 is for soft woods, 1 in 8 is for hardwoods. That is a good rule to follow, but maybe it's just me. But if you look at these tails here, I think that's a really pleasing angle to the eye. So I go for 1 in 8. This is a dovetail marker I made. You can buy these online, and I'm just going to mark down, and I don't need to worry how far I'm going, just far enough thicker than the thickness of the pin board. Now, if you find when you're cutting dovetails, you may have tried hand cut joints before, and you tend to like cutting on one side. Some people like cutting down to the right, some people to the left. What you could do at this point is mark out the angle on all the right sides and then flip the board and do all the right sides on that. So then you only need to worry about one side and you can flip the board. Or if you don't like cutting at an angle at all, the angle you cut there, if I can show you on screen, you can tilt the board. If you use a square, it can help you gauge what's plumb. So now the board is tilted in the vise, and then you just need to worry about cutting straight. So if you don't like cutting at an angle, that is a good tip. But I don't mind cutting at an angle, and I'm going to mark the angles on one side. And with practice, you'll be able to do that as well. So as you can see, I've drawn the tails here. I've gone down quite far, definitely further than the thickness of the board. Now the reason I do this is it's going to allow me to only mark out the waist. Some people use a marking gauge at the beginning of the dovetail cutting process. They mark all the way around the board, and then later, once you put the joint together, you're going to have a marking line in the tail area, and I think that's pretty ugly, to be honest. And even if you don't like that, you've got a lot of flushing off to do after. You have to use a hand plane or a sander to remove those marking gauge lines. And that can even expose gaps in the final joint, especially if you've done an undercut. So I only mark the waist, then you don't need to worry about cleaning up that marking gauge line in the end. So, because the thickness of the boards, because the boards are two different thicknesses, I'm going to have to set the marking gauge twice. And I'm going to go about 1.5 millimeters over the thickness of the walnut, and I'll lock that in. So the reason I do that is I want the tails and the pins to protrude, and then you can flush them off after. You never want it to be flush. Okay, now the marking gauge is set. I'm going to see those marks I made with a pencil, and I'm going to mark in between them. And I don't want to be really quick and go across the whole board. I want to place the gauge down slowly and roll the marking gauge in between those two lines. Now that is a benefit of one of these wheel marking gauges. I'm not really a fan of the marking gauges with a pin because normally they're a bit blunt and they kind of scratch the surface. They don't cut it, but with a wheel marking gauge, they really cut the fibers and you get a really clean line. And also with the wheel, you can roll up to the line. With a pin, it's quite difficult to creep up to a mark. So as you can see, I'm rolling the wheel, and now I'm going to get a really accurate marking gauge line. Now with the pin board, on the show face, I'm going in between the lines because that is the face you're going to see. But with the edge, you want to go all the way across. The back, because it's on the inside of the joint, you can go all the way across the back. And you don't want to press too hard, you want to go lightly first because you don't want to go off track. Sometimes it can follow the grain. And you can do this a couple of times until you get the depth you want, and then the last edge. Like that. Okay, so now I've done the marking gauge line, it's time to start cutting the tails. Now there's only one thing you need to worry about when cutting the tails, and that is you're cutting square to the edge of the board. It doesn't matter what angle the tails are. Remember, you haven't cut the pins yet, you're cutting the pins to fit the tails. If one of the angles of the tails is 1 in 7 or 1 in 6, you're not really going to notice, but you would notice a gap. If the saw is not square, then on this face of the dovetail, you're going to notice a gap. You can see all these lines are pretty square. But if one of these angles was slightly not matching the others, you're not going to notice because there's still not going to be a gap. And this is a point I do need to stress, because as you're cutting, if you notice a saw slightly wandering off track, you don't want to correct it. And you can sort of correct these saws because the teeth, the kerf is slightly wider than the thickness of the piece of metal. You can turn the saw ever so slightly in the cut. So even if your cut is going off, a hair thickness, just keep going. You want to keep going down that angle that the saw is cutting. And with practice, you'll be able to get very close to the line. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to show you, I'm going to cut one slightly off the line, and I'll show you it still won't affect the final joint. And yeah, so let's give it a go. And if you've noticed in the past you found it hard to start the saw, that might be because you're using quite a low TPI. You might be using a 14 TPI and you're going at an angle and there's a bit of a jolt at the start. So what I recommend is placing the saw flat on the edge of the board, using your fingers as a fence so you're sawing in the right place, and you want to gently go back and forth to create a groove. Once you've got a groove started, then you can press a bit harder. And at this point, my saw is not plumb, it is angled. And I want to roughly see where I want to cut. This is the angle I'm going to commit to. And I'm going to start gently going. And you can hear it start to bite a bit more now, so I can press a bit harder. So once you've got about this far, you'll notice the saw is going in a certain direction. And I can see that it's going away from the line slightly, but it's only going away from the line about 1/4 of a millimeter. And I'm going to commit to that. It's going to look so much better. I don't want to try and start turning the saw, keeping on track, because then you're not going to get a flat face. So I'm just going to keep going until I get to the marking gauge line. And also, once you've started at this point, the saw you can sort of relax in the cut, because it's going to go where it wants to go now, because you've got enough, because you're so far into the material. Up here, you really got to worry about the angle. But once you're down here, you can relax, you can move this hand and just let the saw cut. And I'm looking on this side until I meet the marking gauge line, and then I'm going to put my head over the other side and keep going until I hit it. If you're nervous about going too far, you can stop a bit shy, because we're going to chisel back later. You can see the saw curve here is slightly wandering in this direction of the line. But once we've sanded this board and these lines are gone, you're not going to be able to tell that line is not 1 in 8. As long as I kept on track and that face is flat and square, is going to be perfect. Okay, so now it's time to do all the others. And that's fine again. I didn't keep to the line, but that's not going to show in the final joint. And you can buy jigs that you can hold against the piece of wood, and that keeps your saw perfectly square. It also helps you with the angle. The main thing is the squareness here. And that isn't cheating, you know, it's still, you can count it as a hand tool, a jig, you know. We use jigs in woodworking all the time, so there's no reason why you can't use a jig for hand cut joinery. But if you keep practicing, you don't need a jig. One way of helping you saw square and also speed up the dovetail cutting process is if you're cutting a box or a drawer. On a drawer, let's say these are the two sides of the drawer, you want both sides, the tails, to be exactly the same. So you can butt both sides of the drawer up together, put that in the vise, and because now you've got a much longer reference line, your saw is going to be squarer, if that is a word, and it's going to be a bit quicker. I'd recommend using a lower TPI saw because the board is now thicker. Using a 14 TPI will be no problem, and you can cut both sides of the drawer at the same time, and that's going to help it be a bit more accurate because you've got a longer line to reference off. So we've got one more to cut here. Again, I'm using my thumbnail, and I've got my fingers on the edge of the board. My thumb is going to help keep the saw on the line. Okay, I've committed to that angle. And I've moved my hand away now so I can have a good view of both sides. Okay, good. Now at this point, you've got to remove the waste. Some people take the board out, put it on the vise, put it on the bench, and get a chisel and start hammering away the waste. That is quite a time-consuming way of doing it. I wouldn't recommend doing it like that. I would get a fret saw with a very thin blade, the type of blade you'd use on a scroll saw. And again, this is not cheating because it is a hand tool. I don't know why everyone doesn't do this. This is just a fret saw, a very thin blade, and that can go into the curve you just made with the dovetail saw, and you can scoop out that waste really quickly. You don't need to chisel it out very slowly. So as I'm cutting, I'm turning the saw blade so I don't go deeper. I want to turn the fret saw blade to cut across the grain. And you'll get, you want to go slowly at the end so you don't cut into the tail. Okay, and the next one. And you'll notice on this fret saw, the body is bent upwards, and that is especially for cutting across a board. This is most commonly done on when you're cutting dovetails on, let's say, the side of a cabinet, so it's a very long board. Having this clearance here allows you to cut along a long board. Other fret saws that don't have a bent body, like this one, is quite limiting. I would be able to do this one because it's quite a small board, but if the board was longer, the body would start hitting the piece of wood. So if you have one of these, that's great. You can do continuous cuts. If you have one of these fret saws, that's not an issue. All you need to do is turn the saw blade slightly. And you can do that with some pliers. You can pinch the saw blade and turn it. And then that means your saw will then be able to cut at an angle. So you'll be cutting diagonally, and that's not an issue. You have to enter the cut at an angle, turn around, and then you can cut as long of a board as you want, because the saw blade is then turned horizontally. Well, I got it about 45 degrees, but that works really well. Okay, so we've removed the inside pins. Now you want to remove the outside pins. The best tool to use for this is a crosscut saw because you're going to get a clean edge, but that's only if you're going to be cutting on the marking gauge line and you want it to be that neat. But because we're going to be chiseling back to the marking gauge line, you can just use a dovetail saw. And I'm not going to cut on the line. And I'm not going to cut on the line. I'm going to go off about 1.5 millimeters. You want to go as close as you can without touching it. Okay, do the other side. You want to be very careful you don't go too far and cut into the tail. So you go slowly at the end. Okay, so now the tails are cut, it's time to chisel back to the marking gauge line. So I'm going to get a scrap board, put that on the bench because I don't want to chisel or mark the workbench. I'm going to put the board on top. Now you can clamp this down and freehand chisel. I do that most of the time, but I'm going to show you a method that is quick, easy, and you'll get very good results every single time. And that is just getting a scrap piece of wood, and you need a jointer, a planer for this, and you want to joint two sides that are perfectly square, like that. And once you've got two square edges, you want to put that on top of the board and line it up with the marking gauge line. Now this might take a little bit of time, but once you've got it accurate, it means when you're chiseling, your chiseling is then going to be very accurate. And you can even use a chisel, put that in the marking gauge line to help you line up the board. So that's good there. And I'm going to clamp that to the side of the workbench. You want it to be really accurate, and it's worth taking the time to get it right. Okay, so that's perfectly in line with the marking gauge line. So now the chiseling process is actually a lot easier because I don't need to worry about the chisel being at the wrong angle. I just need to place the chisel in the right place and hit down, and this face of the planed edge will guide me down perfectly straight. Now obviously you don't want to go in at an angle and bruise the tails, and you don't want to put the chisel straight away in the marking gauge line because then you're going to be cutting too much material, and because of the bevel of the chisel, if you're hogging away too much material, it's going to push the chisel back into the wood, move the block, and you're going to bruise that face. It's going to end up as a gap in the final joint. So I'm going to put some safety glasses on because I've chiseled before and chips can fly everywhere and you don't want to chip in your eye, and also some earmuffs. So I've got a wooden mallet here. I like the flat head wooden mallets. Carvers use round heads, but for stuff like this, I like a flat head. I get a bit more control with that. And what you want to be doing when you're chiseling, whether you're using this block or not, you want to be halving the material every single time until it's too little that you then put the chisel in the marking gauge line. So I don't actually have a ton of material to remove because with a fret saw I got quite close, and that comes with practice. And I'm just going to do two cuts. So I'm going to do one halving the distance, and then I'll put the chisel in the marking gauge line. Okay, now I'm going to put it in the marking gauge line. And go halfway down because we'll flip the board later. Okay, and now because we set up this jig, if we didn't do that at this point, you would flip the board over, do the other side, and then these end pins you would do in the vise. But because this jig is so accurate, it's got a flat edge and we clamped it in position, we can even use this jig to chisel back the end pins. And you want to be looking ever so often that you're staying on track. You definitely don't want the jig to move, so check that the jig hasn't moved as you've been hitting. And I can see that the jig is helping me cut right down that marking gauge line. Okay, so the jig moved a bit there, but it moved after I hit, so that's all right. Now it's time to flip the board over. And because we use the marking gauge to mark the whole width of the board, setting up this side will be a bit easier. I can even use a large chisel, put that in the marking gauge line, and then butt the piece of wood up against it. Ideally, you would have a clamp on the other side as well, or a hold fast. If you have a hold fast, you'd clamp it down here, and that will prevent the jig from moving as well. This jig is so helpful, help you cutting straight. We will probably be doing an undercut later, just to guarantee that the pins and the tails seat properly. Okay, and finally, the end pins. Okay. Okay, so I've cleaned up the tails, but I'm just going to do a little bit more in the moxing vise by hand. I'm going to do a bit of an undercut. Undercuts are pretty helpful because there can sometimes be some fuzziness in the corners of the joints which prevent the two pieces of wood to sit together cleanly. And doing an undercut basically creates a little bit of space that the fuzzy areas can go to. If you didn't know what an undercut is, that is, you get your chisel and you go a little bit deeper in the middle. You don't want to do it near the ends, just in the middle, just going a tiny bit lower than the surface of, the marking gauge line. And And if you go near the end, the issue with that is when you flush the joint off later, if you go too deep with the plane, that can show up as a gap in the final joint. Right now I'm just removing some of the areas that the saw didn't get to in the middle. You want the walls of the tails to be completely flat. If there's any bit at the bottom that is sticking out, it's going to push the two boards apart and they won't sit properly together and you're going to get a gap. Got that? Okay, so the tailboard is complete. It's time to mark out the pins. Now, later on we're going to add a chamfer to the bottom of the tails, but you don't want to do that now because that's going to make the marking out process very inaccurate. And sometimes when you're cutting dovetails, you might have a rebate skew block plane. And you'll see people on YouTube like Rob Cosman using this method where before they cut the tails, they'll use a skew block plane to shave off a little bit of material, and that's going to create a rebate. So when you're butting up the tails on the pin board, that's going to give you a really nice positive stop and you can mark out those lines. But if you don't want to cut that rebate, you can make a rebate by just using some masking tape. And I'm just going to put about 5 strips down. And as you can see, I'm going over the marking gauge line. This doesn't need to be neat at all. So now I've added, theoretically, a bit of material. It doesn't need to be thick at all. That's about 1 millimeter thick. And I'm going to go back and use my marking gauge, which is still set the same thickness as I cut before. And I'm going to run that over the masking tape. Like that. And I need to do one more because I didn't go deep enough. So now, see, that is a really quick method. And now I theoretically have added on a rebate to my board. So here's my pin board. And I'm going to put that in the vise. And I'm going to line that up to the thickness of my plane. We want it the exact same height because we've added on a rebate. We haven't taken it away. Like that. And now I'm going to put the tailboard on top. Now, actually, I'm going to show you another tip because if you're using a dark wood, you might find it hard to see the marking gauge line. So you can use some masking tape. You can put that on top of the board and then get your marking knife, go around it. So then the end of the board is going to be either white if you're using white masking tape or green, which is a really obvious, contrast. It's going to be much easier to see the marks you've made. I'm going to go back to the vise, line it up with the plane. Now I can put the tailboard on top, use my marking knife, and I want a big chisel. The big chisel helps me line up the two boards so they're both flat and in line with each other. As you can see, the tailboard is stopping as it's hitting the masking tape. So that is really helpful. That is exactly where the marking gauge line is because we cut it into the masking tape. I'm going to butt up this board. That is in position, and it's time to use the marking knife. You want to go gently at first, and then go deeper. If you go too fast at the beginning, too hard I mean, then it can sometimes follow the grain. So you want to do a very light pressure at the beginning with a knife. Then once you've got that groove established, you can go a bit harder. Okay. So if this was just in walnut, seeing those knife lines might be quite difficult, but now I use some masking tape on the top of the board. It's green, and I can peel these waste areas away. Oh, a bit of the masking tape came off with it, that's fine. But you get the idea of, you've got to be careful when you lift up the masking tape that it doesn't come with it. And if the masking tape was there, you would then can really easily reference your saw right up against the masking tape and see where you need a cut. So because I can see the knife lines, I've taken off the masking tape. I don't need that. And I'm going to use a square to mark down the edge of the board. Again, you don't want to use a knife for this, because if you go off the knife line, you're going to see that as a very thin hairline gap. But with a pencil, you won't see that in the final joint because you'll sand it away. Okay, now before we cut, because this board is a different thickness, I'm going to reset my marking gauge to 1.5 millimeters over the thickness of the tailboard. So I'm only going to mark the waste areas, and I'm going to roll the wheel to the line. Now, because this is the pin board and there's outside pins, we don't need to mark the ends of the boards. It's only the faces, and the back, because it's the inside of the joint, we can run the gauge all the way through again. Okay, now it's time to use a dovetail saw again and cut these out. This one is a little bit harder than cutting the tails because the saw needs to be square, but it also needs to be plumb as you're cutting down. Because now we've cut the tails, it doesn't matter how the tails come out, we really need the pins to fit. This will take some practice. You might need to cut lots of joints, but I assure you, if you cut lots in a day, you'll see the progression. And also a good tip, if you just want to practice your cutting, you can just get some waste scrap wood, put it in the vise, draw some lines with a square and a dovetail saw and a dovetail gauge, and just try and follow the lines, and that's going to really improve your sawing. Also, what will help you saw plumb and square is holding the saw correctly. You want to hold your dovetail saw with your index finger pointing forward on this area of the saw, the thumb on the other side, the 3 fingers in the handle. If all your fingers were in the handle, obviously with the saw it's a bit crammed, so it's a bit uncomfortable, and you don't have any direction because this feels the same as this, and that feels the same as that. But as soon as you've got your index finger forward, you know you're cutting straight. So that's a little tip. You've got to make sure you're holding the saw right. Now it's time to cut the pin board. So it's the exact same. I'm using my fingers as a fence to guide the saw. I want to go right up to that line. Some people, when they're starting out, will go off the line and then chisel back. But if you're starting out, I wouldn't even attempt that, because that is not the best practice. You want to learn from being able to saw straight from the line. As soon as you start chiseling walls of dovetails, it gets a lot more complicated. It gets a lot harder because you need a chisel square. It's way easier to learn to cut square than to chisel to a line. It might take longer. Maybe you've already been cutting dovetails and you're chiseling the side walls. You're trying to make them, you know, flat. Maybe that's why you might be getting gaps in your joints. So practice cutting on the line. It might take a bit of time, but once you've got it, it's going to make the dovetail cutting process a lot faster and should be a bit more accurate as well. Getting a light on your work. I'm in a really well-lit room, so this is helpful. But if you're in a dark shed, I'll definitely get a small light you can put on your workbench that is shining on the piece of work, because that is going to highlight these knife lines really well. And obviously, if you notice yourself going off the line, then you may need to chisel it. But with practice, you won't need to. Sometimes there's always a little bit of chiseling to do, because if you're dovetailing a very wide board, to get all of them perfect is sometimes impossible. So it doesn't matter if you have to do. I just wouldn't aim to chisel all the walls by not cutting on the line. You want to try and cut on the line, and then if you need to do a bit of chiseling, then that's what you need to do. And as I'm cutting, you want the show face to be towards you, because if you're using a Western saw, the teeth are cutting on the push, which means there's going to be more chip out on this side. And if there is going to be any chip out, you want it hidden inside the joint, and you want the clean edge to be towards you. If you're using a Japanese saw, then normally those saw blades are a lot thinner anyway, so you don't need to worry. The saw cuts on the pull with a Japanese saw, so you'd still want the show face towards you, and then you can see better what you're doing, but you don't need to worry about chip out as much when you're using the Japanese saw. Now with the Western saw, as I'm cutting, you'll notice I'm angling the saw down first to meet the marking gauge line. Then I'll look the other way and tilt the saw upwards to meet the other line. So I'm tilting the saw now. I am going slowly to meet that marking gauge line, and then I'm gonna flatten that out a bit and angle the other way to look when I meet the line. And now in the middle there'll be a bit of a dome which you can slowly flatten out. Okay, now again, with this cutting, you want to cut on the waist side. So where the marking lines are, if you find that difficult, you can mark with a pencil where the waste is. You want to cut on the inside. It's very important not to cut on the other side of the marking knife line, because then you'll be cutting either too far in and there'll be a big gap, or too far the other way and the joint won't fit together. So make sure you're cutting on the right side of the line. And we're going to go back to the fret saw to hog out this material quickly. Now with practice you can get quite close to the marking gauge line. The further you are away, obviously the more chiseling you have to do. And you want to go slowly at the end. You'll be able to hear, with the cutting, you'll be able to hear the noise change when the wood's getting a bit weaker and more fragile. It will ping off. Like that. Now I've got a very thin blade in my fret saw because that allows me to fit into the curve. If your fret saw is cutting quite slowly, maybe the blade is dull, or have a look at the blade you're using. I'm using a skip tooth blade, which means it's got a very low TPI, so it leaves a rougher surface. That doesn't matter because we're chiseling it anyway. It's a bit coarser. It's going to cut a lot quicker. But again, you're never looking for a finished edge of one of these, so it doesn't really matter if it's going to leave a rough edge. Okay, so that's cut. And now I'm going to chisel the waste back to the marking gauge line. I'm going to use the jig again. So I'm going to bring the block up. Be very careful to get it right on the marking gauge line. And you want to use a really strong clamp so this wood doesn't move. So I'm going to be halving the material, taking little bits off at a time. You want to make sure your chisels are very sharp. If they're blunt, it's going to leave a very rough surface, and there's more chance of your chisel being pushed back into the work, squashing that marking gauge line and going further than the marking gauge line actually, and it can really bruise the joint and sharp as gaps. And also, the sharper your chisels are, the less work you have to do. You won't need to hit as hard, and it'll be quicker to cut the joint. Okay, so now I'm close enough, I can put the I can put the chisel in the marking gauge line. And once I've chiseled this, I will tell you another little tip for removing this waste very accurately. If you've got a lot of dovetails to cut, let's say you're doing a piece of furniture, or you're just doing a lot of dovetail boxes and you're on a bit of a production run, I'll show you a really good way of removing this waste quickly. It's a little bit of a cheat because you're then using a power tool. It's not all hand tools, but if you don't mind that, and you don't mind adding a power tool, then it's perfect, because if you're doing router dovetails with a router jig, you can normally tell it's been done by a router because the pins are quite large and the pins and tails are normally the same thickness. But with this tip, you can get dovetails that look hand cut but are done a lot faster. And the way you do that is you would first cut with your dovetail saw. You can cut all the way down with your dovetail saw. And then with your fret saw, you cut across. You only need to cut down about half the thickness of the tail. So one really easy way of cleaning up the pin board is using a top bearing router bit. Now, you are using a router, but if you don't mind that, it's a brilliant way of doing it. Now, the way to do that is you still do the same thing. You use a dovetail saw and go all the way down like we have. Then you would use your fret saw to hog away the material. You don't need to go as low this time though. You can go half the thickness. And then you need to buy a top bearing flush trim bit. And there are specialist bits where the cutting area is about 1 centimetre. You don't want a long one, obviously, because you want the bearing to reference off the top of the pins. So you can get these very small 1/4 inch flush trim bits with a top bearing. And what you do is you clamp the board into your vise. You then get 2 other pieces of the wood and clamp them on the top of the bottom, so you have a bit of a table for the router to reference from, and it won't wobble and it won't wobble. And once you have that, I'll just demonstrate. So you've got these boards clamped on with some F-clamps here, so a lot of surface area. And then you can plunge the router down to the thickness, you'd set that before, the thickness of the tail where the marking gauge is. And that bearing would reference off these walls and then cut that bottom bed perfectly. You know, it would be equal along the whole board. You won't need to do any chiseling. You don't need to do an undercut because it's done with a router, which is very accurate. And yeah, so if you don't mind using a router in your work, or if you're doing a lot of dovetails, that is a way of implementing a router into hand-cut dovetails without making it look like a router did it. Normally with router dovetails, the router would cut out the tails and the pins, which means they'd be really big because the router bit has to fit in that gap. But you could still use a router with hand-cut dovetails with a flush trim bit hogging out all this material. It just makes that process a lot quicker. But I don't have that here today, so I'm just going to flip the board over and do the other side. And now I've put the chisel in the marking gauge line, I can use my thumb to push the chisel against this block. So then I know I'm cutting perfectly square. So because I didn't use a router, I'm just going to do a subtle undercut, so then the tailboard meets the bottom perfectly. You don't want any high spots. Now this is a point where you give the pin board a look. If you notice any of the tails, any of the pins aren't plumb and square, you should do a little bit of chiseling just to make sure that they're square. If the pins are flared out at the bottom, that means as you're hitting the tails in, it's going to get tighter and tighter, and then the pin board's going to split because it's like a wedge. So you want them to be completely squared down, and that means if the pins fit at the top, they're going to fit at the bottom, and the board won't split. Okay, so they look pretty good. Just going to do a little test just to see. It looks like this pin is slightly too big. So just shave a little bit off, but I'm not going to shave any off the show face because then it's very easy to go too far and that show up as a joint. So I'm just going to remove some material on the inside face. That looks pretty good. Okay, before I put the tails in, I'm just going to add a tiny chamfer on the bottom of the tailboard. That's going to help make the tailboard go in a bit easier. And also if there's any fuzziness in the corners of the pin board, then any loose sawdust can go into those gaps I'm making. Now you don't want the chamfer to go to the end of the board because the tails protrude a bit and you're going to flush the joint off later. So you want to start the chamfer about 3 millimeters in and go down like that. And this just rounds over the bottom of the tailboard and helps direct the tails in. Like that. Okay, so now it's time to test fit it. If you're making a drawer or the box before you glue a dovetail together, it's important to pre-wax or pre-oil the inside because it's very difficult to get into that corner later. Also, if there's any glue squeeze out, if you pre-finish the inside of your box, then the glue's not going to stick and it's going to be really easy to just pop the glue off after. So let's hit it in and see how it looks. I'm also going to hit it in pretty slowly because if you whack it in, then it can split. I'm going to do it slowly, see if there's any stress. If there is stress, then I'm going to take the joint apart again, remove some more material. It's looking pretty good. Just readjusting the vise. Get a scrap piece of wood just to get it down further. Okay, so that dovetail has come out very nicely, as you can see there. And at this point, you'd obviously want to glue the joint. If there are any gaps, the dovetail, there we go, it's looking pretty good. As you can see, the pins and the tails are protruding. Now, this is important because once the joint has dried and glued, it's very easy to just flush off these high spots than it is the whole surface. If it was flat, then you've got a lot of material to remove, but you just need to knock these off. Or you can just round over these edges and add a little chamfer on them. I've seen that being done before with protruding dovetails with little chamfers on the end, and that is a really nice effect. So, if there is a gap in your joint at this point, obviously you want to keep practicing so then there's no gaps, but if there is a gap, what you would want to do is get either you can do this with a small metal hammer, or you can get a small rod. And what you can do is once the joint is glued together, you can use that rod and hit the protruding pins or tails out, and you can kind of spread them out and mushroom them over. They do this in metalwork a lot. And I can't actually see any gaps to fill, but just to demonstrate it, you would very slightly kind of smush the ends over, and you can smush them into the gaps. And this is a really good tip if you're doing a lot of dovetails. The chances of them being all perfect is very low, I should say. Yeah, it's very unlikely they'll all be perfect. So if you're doing a big cabinet and you see one dovetail not fitting perfectly, it might be really annoying, but it doesn't matter. If they're protruding, you can spread the wood out, you can kind of smush it. No one would notice, it would fill in the gap. And then later, once the glue is dried, you can sand it flat. But before you go, I'll give you one last tip that I'm pretty sure I came up with. I've seen no one else do this before, and I think it's great. And that is, a lot of people, once they put a joint together, it's very difficult to get the joint apart again. They'll wiggle it, and that can bruise these inside walls because you're kind of removing the joint apart the wrong way. As in, it went in that way, it should go out perfectly that way. But if you're wiggling it, it will kind of bruise these walls, and when you put the joint back together, it will show up as a gap. Some people also hold one wall and use a mallet and trying to hit that piece out, but again, that will bend that board down and it can snap. So I've come up with this way. I called it the Dovetail Removal Pin. These are really easy to cut on the bandsaw, and as you can see, the end profile is just a very small pin, and I just went into the bandsaw, tilt the wood either side, trim the ends off, and now I've got a very small pin that is smaller than the pin on the joint, as you can see. So if you want to test fit your dovetails before gluing, this is the perfect way, because I've now put the joint together. I can see it looks good. If there was a gap, you don't want to peen over the tails yet because you haven't had the glue in. You've test fitted the joint, and the way you remove it is put the board in the vise, and you can really easily remove the joint again with this pin and a mallet. So what I'm going to do is very slowly hit the pin board out. And as you can see, that is a really simple way of removing your dovetails. It's very easy. It's not going to affect the walls. It's not going to bruise the walls. You're not going to struggle and stress out your joint. And yeah, so that's a good way of test fitting your dovetails before you glue them, because some people don't test fit, just add a lot of glue, hit the joint together, and it might not fit right and it might split. So I always like test fitting my dovetails before gluing. So that's the dovetail complete. Thank you very much for sticking with me with this joint exercise. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you're interested in any of the tools I used, there'll be a link in the description to Axminster's website where you can buy everything I used in this video. And give it a go for yourself. I'd recommend just cutting 5 joints in a row if you're starting out. You'll definitely see the progression from the first one to the last one, and in no time you'll be cutting perfect dovetails. Also, if you've got any questions about anything I did in this video, make sure you comment down below and we'll reply to your comments. So thank you for sticking with us. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you learned something, and we'll see you very soon for another Woodworking Wisdom. Bye.